Let us now begin our journey of learning about cerebrum. In this video, we will be learning its general features. Cerebral hemispheres are the largest parts of the brain. They are the highest centers for controlling motor activities. They are the highest level of projection for both general and special senses, where these sensations are consciously perceived. Parts of the cerebral hemisphere which belong to limbic system are involved in memory and emotions. And although human beings do not possess the largest brain when compared to some of the larger animals, human brain has relatively larger association areas where multiple sensory inputs are integrated. So they can be either modality specific or they may integrate multimodal inputs. So these larger association areas is what sets human brains apart from the other brains. Human brain also has a relatively larger prefrontal region, which is concerned with highest aspect of cognitive function and is responsible for one's personality, foresight, and planning. So there are two cerebral hemispheres which occupy the supratentorial compartment of the cranial cavity. They're separated by the great longitudinal fissure, which contains a fold of dura mater known as falx cerebri. At the depth of this longitudinal fissure, the two cerebral hemispheres are linked by a bundle of commissural fibers known as corpus callosum. When we learn about this basic internal organization, it is very similar to the cerebellum. So it has an outer cortex made up of grey matter. Now this grey matter is made up of all the neurons that receive information from various parts of the central nervous system and sends information to different parts of the central nervous system. Deep to this cortex, it has white matter, which is made up of intracortical association fibers, intercortical commissural fibers, and corticopetal and corticofugal projection fibers. Within this white matter, there is collection of grey matter commonly known as basal ganglia, but it needs to be addressed as basal nuclei. So again, like in cerebellum, we have an outer cortex, inner white matter, within which there is collection of grey matter known as basal nuclei. Within the cerebellum, we have a cavity of lateral ventricle. This is actually a C-shaped ventricular cavity having a central part or known as body with an anterior, posterior and inferior limbs. These lateral ventricles, which are the cavities of cerebral hemispheres, connect or communicate with the third ventricle through foramina of Monro, otherwise known as interventricular foramen. This third ventricle is the cavity of diencephalon, so it is surrounded by thalamus, hypothalamus and subthalamus. Each cerebral hemisphere has three poles. To begin with, the telencephalic vesicles from which the cerebral hemispheres develop, they were initially spherical in shape, but soon the central part will begin to grow at a slower rate compared to the surrounding areas. So the surrounding area will fold in such a way that it forms a C-shaped folding, so that what was initially present posteriorly, that will now move forwards and laterally. Because of this folding, the cerebral hemisphere begins to develop three poles: an anterior pole, which is the frontal pole in relation to frontal bone; this middle one, which is the temporal pole located in the middle cranial fossa. This was the original posterior pole before folding. And now after folding, there is a new posterior pole that is known as occipital pole, because that is in relation to occipital bone. So each cerebral hemisphere demonstrates three poles: a frontal pole, temporal pole and occipital pole. Each cerebral hemisphere shows three surfaces. Because they are located within the cranial cavity, there is a superolateral surface which is located within the or inside the concavity of the vault of the skull, so it is convex. Then there is a medial surface with which it is abutting the opposite cerebral hemisphere. That surface is flat. And then there is an inferior surface which mounts to the base of the skull. So this inferior surface has two parts: an anterior orbital part and a posterior tentorial part. This anterior orbital part sits on the roof of anterior cranial fossa, where it is in relation to cribriform plate of ethmoid bone, orbital plate of the frontal bone, and the lesser wing of sphenoid. The tentorial portion, anterior part is in the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior portion is in relation to upper surface of tentorium cerebelli. Each cerebral hemisphere has three borders: a superomedial border which separates the superolateral surface from the medial surface, an inferolateral border which separates the superolateral surface from the inferior surface. You're seeing the two borders on the profile here. That's the superomedial border, and this is the inferolateral border. Then we have an inferomedial border which separates the medial surface from the inferior surface. This inferomedial border is again interrupted in the middle by the presence of diencephalon. Phylogenetically, there are three parts of cerebrum. The oldest part to develop or evolve was the archicortex. Next was the paleocortex. Though I'm showing them as C-shaped structures, they're better developed only on the inferior aspect, and they're almost absent on the upper parts. These two together, archicortex and paleocortex together, are known as allocortex. And the rest of the cerebral hemisphere is what we call as neocortex, which is much more recent in its evolution. And that is the largest part. Archicortex is made up of three layers microscopically. Paleocortex shows 4 to 5 layers, whereas neocortex demonstrates 6 layers from outside inwards. The outermost layer is the molecular layer, followed by outer granular layer and outer pyramidal layer. Next will be inner granular layer and inner pyramidal layer. And the sixth or the innermost layer is the pleomorphic layer. Unlike in cerebellum, where the thickness of the cerebellar cortex was uniform throughout, in cerebral cortex, the thickness of the cortex varies from place to place, and thickness of individual layers also vary from place to place. For more details, you can visit this site, or you can visit this YouTube video to study the microscopic features of cerebral cortex. To increase the surface area, the surface of the cerebrum undergoes multiple extensive folding, resulting in surface depressions and elevations. Surface depressions are known as sulci or sulcus for a singular, and elevations are known as gyrus or gyri. So if you extend this whole folding, the total surface area of the cerebrum is about 2200 square centimeter, but with folding into sulci and gyri, only 1/3 of this area is exposed to the surface, rest of it is buried in the depth. Each cerebral hemisphere is made up of 6 lobes. When you see the superolateral surface, 2 prominent sulci which we see is, one of them is the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. This is running backwards and slightly upwards for a distance of about 7 to 8 centimeters. This is just above the temporal pole. And second sulcus starts from the superomedial border just behind the midpoint, and this will run forwards and downwards, making an angle of about 70 degrees with the superomedial border. And this is the central sulcus of Rolando. Again, it's about 8 centimeters in length. Then, about 5 centimeters anterior to the occipital pole along the superomedial border, we have parieto-occipital sulcus. Similar distance anterior to the occipital pole, that's about 5 centimeters anterior to the occipital pole, there's a small depression known as preoccipital incisure on the inferolateral border. So we use these 4 landmarks to first mark some of the lobes on the superolateral surface. We connect parieto-occipital sulcus and preoccipital incisure by an imaginary line, and we extend the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus to meet this first imaginary line by a second imaginary line. So now this will divide the superolateral surface into 4 areas. The first one is the frontal lobe, which is above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and in front of central sulcus of Rolando. Because it is in relation to frontal bone, it is known as frontal lobe. Then we have parietal lobe. This is the area behind the central sulcus of Rolando, above the posterior ramus and the imaginary line extended from there. and in front of the first imaginary line connecting parieto-occipital sulcus and preoccipital incisure. Again, this part of the cerebrum is in relation to parietal bone, so known as parietal lobe. The area of the superolateral surface, which is below the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and anterior to the first imaginary line, is known as temporal lobe. It's related to temporal bone. And the area behind the first imaginary line is the occipital lobe, related to occipital bone. Now, if you separate the lips of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, then you will see the upper surface of the temporal lobe, which will be having auditory areas. The rest of the buried area here, the grey matter which you are seeing, that is the fifth lobe known as insula. So you will see this insula only if you separate the lips of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and see that this particular lobe is buried in the depth. The sixth lobe is seen on the medial aspect. There is a diencephalon, and then there is the cerebral hemisphere, which is developed from telencephalon. So at the junction between this diencephalon and telencephalon, there are certain structures at the border. So these structures forming the border between diencephalon and the telencephalon, they form the sixth lobe known as limbic lobe. So there are totally 6 lobes. A frontal lobe, you can actually see part of the frontal lobe on the medial aspect as well. So frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, buried insular lobe, which is seen from the superolateral aspect, and limbic lobe, which is seen on the medial aspect. So to summarize, there are 2 cerebral hemispheres, each having 3 poles, frontal, occipital and temporal, 3 surfaces, superolateral, medial and inferior, 3 borders, superomedial, inferolateral and inferiomedial, and 6 lobes, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, insular and limbic lobes. From outside inwards, there is an outermost cortex or grey matter, inner white matter, and there is central basal nuclei, which are a collection of grey matter within the white matter, and each cerebral hemisphere has a cavity of lateral ventricle. Phylogenetically, there are 3 parts of cerebrum. The oldest one is the archicortex, then we have paleocortex, and the most recent one is the neocortex. They are also alternatively named as archipallium, paleopallium and neopallium. Neocortex is made up of 6 layers microscopically. And surface of the cerebral hemisphere is folded to exhibit multiple sulci and gyri. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this video. You can visit this site for other neuroanatomy videos. Thank you.